So again, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing well today. For those of you who I have not met before, my name is Neil, and during today's session, we're going to talk for approximately the next hour about some of the new features that Microsoft has rolled into Excel over the last few years. Let's call it 2019 till today. And specifically, we're talking here about the new functions that you'll have available to you if you have Excel 2019, Excel 2021, or Excel for Microsoft 365. Now, as you can see, I just turned on the recording here today, so I'll make that available to everybody after our session is over. And I'm happy to follow up with you all via email if there's anything that I can do for you after today's session is over. Don't hesitate to reach out via email and ask any questions that sort of trail off of what we're going to do today. As we're doing a webinar here today, we have a lot of things to do. Let's try to keep it mostly to the chat today instead of coming off of mute. Want to make sure that I can get a full head of steam and hit all of the major areas. And additionally, everybody, before going any farther, if you are curious to check out what I'm doing in the spreadsheet, if you want to download the PDF guide that goes with today's session, those are accessible via the link that just went into the chat. Okay, so our goal today is to talk about the broader world of new functions that have been introduced in about the last 4 years to Microsoft Excel. And I can think of those as breaking down into a few major areas. The first area is probably the easiest to explain, and that is that VLOOKUP has been around and been very important to a lot of people for a very long time. And Microsoft recently introduced the XLOOKUP function, which is just a beautiful replacement for VLOOKUP. You can still use VLOOKUP if you want, but XLOOKUP is better in nearly every way I can think of. And then we get into some interesting ones that solve very specific problems. So there are a lot of new functions whose job it is to look at a set of data and to allow us to eliminate certain things from it, to sort it or filter it or arrange it in different ways. And also some very interesting tools that allow us to take big data sets or multiple data sets, combine them together, split them apart, reshape them, doing a lot of the things with this one right here that you would normally do with copying and pasting. So I want you to start thinking about these points for a moment here as we get rolling, everybody. So we have a direct replacement for VLOOKUP. Then we have some filtering and sorting tools. Then we have basically a direct replacement for copying and pasting content into different combinations. And finally, for breaking text up, putting it back together again. If you have any text like people's names that are in one cell and they need to be in 2 cells, things like that, those are the major 4 areas that we're going to start off with today. So everybody, I'd like to take a second, if you would, just go into the chat right now and pick one of these 4 as the thing that you do more than you do other stuff. Do you do more VLOOKUPs? Do you do more sorting and filtering? Do you do a lot of copying and pasting and reshaping your data? Do you do a lot of breaking text up, putting it back together again, cleaning it up? What do you do more than you do the other stuff? All right. Lots of filtering. Good deal. Thanks, Jill. Lots of lookups. Lookups are coming on strong. Excellent. Okay, good. So we're basically 25, 25, 25, 25 there, looks like. That's good. Good, everybody. Actually, no, I think text splitting is definitely the least interesting one from what I can tell. Good deal. All right, so everybody, those will be our first 4 major areas. And I think those are all tools that you'll look at and you'll go, oh, okay, yeah, if I'm in this situation, if I have this problem, now I can solve that problem. Great. And then we get into 2 areas that aren't really problems, but they speak to people who are sort of next level spreadsheet designers. So the first of those is if you are making some really complicated functions that have a lot of moving parts to them, and you just want to take some time and rewrite those functions in a clean, simple way, then the new let function in Excel lets you create variables in your functions so that you can make a more sophisticated, clean, and reusable function, which is very interesting. But if you're thinking to yourself, is this a new tool that does something over and above what Excel normally does? The answer to that is no. This is about perfecting what you're doing in Excel. And in the same way, the new LAMBDA function is also about perfecting what you do in Excel. It doesn't really introduce a new function per se, but what it lets us do is create a custom function with a custom name to it that we can reuse in our workbook, which could have some very, very interesting applications. But I'll tell you right here off the bat, everybody, these first four, XLOOKUP, filtering, data shaping, and text splitting, those solve real problems that you can look at and you say, I have a problem here. Now I have a tool that solves that problem. The last two really get into higher level thinking about how you want to put your spreadsheet together. They could solve problems that you invent for yourself, but they are kind of interesting and additional on top of that. All right, so some interesting ideas to think about here as we get started, everybody. And I'll just recap for those of you who just joined. Hi, I'm Neil. If you haven't talked to me before, I run a company called Knack Training. And for the next 53 minutes, I'm going to show you as many new Excel functions in real life examples as I can possibly manage. If you have questions throughout, don't hesitate, pop in the chat and ask any questions that occur to you. All right, everybody. So let's get into, oh, first of all, I want to run through this table. This table will be available to you after today's class as well. For those of you who are curious, do I have this function available to me? This is the basic table. Everything that I'm going to be talking about today has been introduced somewhere between 2019 and today. And so if you have Excel from Microsoft 365, you have all these functions. If you have Excel 2021, you have a few of these functions. And if you have Excel 2019, you have fewer of those functions. If nothing else, you should 100% use this as an opportunity to ask for Microsoft 365 at work if you can. All right, as a reminder, please don't hesitate to use my email after today's session is over. I'm going to retype that into the chat. And again, the Notion link is where you can download the course files. All right. First major area for our webinar, everybody. Let's talk about lookups. Okay, so once again, the major plot point here on this particular function is if you have been using VLOOKUP and you have Microsoft 365, you should probably start switching over to XLOOKUP. XLOOKUP was introduced as a out-and-out replacement for what VLOOKUP does, and it does pretty much everything better. You know, if you think about it, it's a pure 1985 versus 2020 question, right? So on my screen right here, we have a 1985 Chevy Cavalier and a 2020 Chevy Cavalier. While the car on the left-hand side may have gone 500,000 miles and still be dependable, at the end of the day, you can't really tell me you would rather keep on using the reliable 1985 car when a perfectly good 2020 car that has a lot of new stuff in it is available to you. So let's talk about what that new stuff is real quick, and I'll show it to you live. Okay, so on the left is what VLOOKUP does. On the right is what XLOOKUP does differently. Item number one, VLOOKUP has always looked for the closest match without going over as the default instead of an exact match by default. XLOOKUP has learned from that mistake. The default is that XLOOKUP always looks for the exact match, but you could also ask it to look for the closest match without going over, or the closest match without going under. So already we can see that XLOOKUP has something that VLOOKUP doesn't have, and it has a change in the way that it works from the older way of doing things to the newer way of doing things. Now, the next area is really kind of interesting. So VLOOKUP could always look for something where the matched value is on the left side of the data, and then it goes across to the right side of the data. It could not go the opposite direction. So people had to learn how to use index and match to be able to go from the right side back to the left side. XLOOKUP does both of those things without introducing any new functions. If you wanted to go horizontally rather than vertically, you would have to switch over to HLOOKUP instead of VLOOKUP. V for vertical, H for horizontal. With XLOOKUP, the X represents both directions at the same time, so you can easily do a horizontal lookup or a vertical lookup with XLOOKUP. So that's, again, you would have had to have learned VLOOKUP, index, match, and HLOOKUP. Now we just have XLOOKUP. And now finally, if you don't find a match for something with VLOOKUP, and you want to say, oh, hey, I didn't find a match or something else like that, you would have had to use another new function, if NA. So that's 5 functions, and XLOOKUP does that built into the box. So XLOOKUP is 1 function versus 5 functions. No brainer, right? The other really interesting thing that it does, and sometimes this can be really helpful, is that VLOOKUP just returns a single value from a cell, but XLOOKUP can return an array of cells. So let's take a look at how that plays itself out here, everybody. So again, this workbook with modern Excel functions is available to you. You can play around with it. There's the completed version and the uncompleted version. Feel free to pick up whichever one you want. So let's talk about from the right side back to the left side. This is something VLOOKUP can't do. If the event number is on the right side of the data, and we want to figure out what the date for that event is, VLOOKUP couldn't do this. XLOOKUP can. So I go over here to cell V6, and the lookup functions are all under the lookup and reference drop-down menu up at the top of the screen. And here is XLOOKUP. So XLOOKUP allows me to say, hey, yeah, let's look for EVT 2022-20, and let's look for those on the right side of this data over here, and return the values from the left side of the data. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. So for those of you who are experienced with VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP does that in a way that VLOOKUP simply can't do, and it does it with absolutely no sweat involved. While I let you marinate on that for a second, let me show you that thing that I told you about a little bit ago about XLOOKUP returning an array of cells. So here, I'm clearly looking for the first name and the last name of this person, DN5310, right? Now with a VLOOKUP, I'd have to do a VLOOKUP for their first name, and then later I'd have to do a VLOOKUP for their last name. But interestingly enough, if I go look for that XLOOKUP function here, I can look up that one ID number in the array of all their ID numbers. And then look at this, right here with the return array, I just tell it, hey, return both the first name column and the last name column. Just like that. Now, everybody, it's not easy to rearrange these columns. It's much, much easier to have it be first name and last name because that's the order that it's in that table right over there. But when I hit OK, sure enough, there's Stephanie and Herrera and everybody else all the way down the line. So even though I'm only putting the function in cell T6, I'm getting the result of the function over here in cell U6 as well. All right, so item number 1, is XLOOKUP worth it? 100,000% it is. It handles error messages. It looks horizontally and vertically. It goes from the left to the right or the right to the left. It goes from bottom to top or top to bottom. It returns the whole name instead of single entries of the name. It does a world of things VLOOKUP doesn't do. Everybody, if you have any questions, if anybody wants me to answer anything or jump through any hoops, go ahead and pop in the chat. Ask me anything you want. Hope everybody's feeling good so far. XLOOKUP, totally worth it. I love that function so much. All right, everybody feeling okay? Looking good. All right. I respond well to thumbs ups. If anybody's got a thumbs up in their repertoire, anything like that. Next up on the hit parade, everybody. All right. So VLOOKUP versus XLOOKUP. There is a very simple, hey, we used to do it this way, now we do it this way sort of question. I like that. This next set, this is just really interesting new ideas that you probably, you thought to yourself, I wonder if Excel can do this. And then you looked around and Excel couldn't do it. And you're just like, I guess I got to do this by hand. So there are a whole bunch of new functions that are called dynamic array functions or spillable functions. And the way that you'll know those spillable functions, everybody, is when you enter one function, it'll put the result of that function into one cell. And then a blue box will go from that cell to other places. And it'll spill into that area as it completes its job, whatever its job happens to be. And very often, these dynamic array functions are for reshaping our data. It can take a big data set and make it smaller. It can make multiple data sets and turn it into one big data set. It could take a wide data set and turn it into a tall data set, vice versa. All of those different interesting combinations you might run into. There's an interesting tool for each of those. So here's a quick rundown of what we're about to see in action, everybody. The first couple will be really easy to understand. The unique function you use when you want a unique list of something. So if you've got a list of all the different customers, right? And you say, hey, unique, could you look at that list of customers? It'll return the unique list of customers. Very helpful. Filter. Again, if you've ever done any sorting or filtering on an Excel list, then you know what the sort and filter functions are about to do. The sort function will just rearrange the data, and filter will hide some of the data and only show the parts where it matches a specific criteria. So those first three, those are things that you've probably thought of 1,000 times before. And then we get into some weird ones. So VSTACK and HSTACK. Everybody, V always stands for vertical, H always stands for horizontal. So if you have a bunch of data sets and you want to stack them on top of each other vertically, or you want to stack them next to each other horizontally, you would be able to use V or HSTACK. I just don't see myself using HSTACK very much, but VSTACK is very interesting. TOCOL, right? You take a whole bunch of data, you turn it into a column. TOROW, you take a whole bunch of data, you turn it into a row. Really, really interesting. And then finally, wrap calls and WRAPROWS. If you have a really wide data set or a really tall data set, and you want to make multiple rows out of it, you can wrap it into rows. So all of these are what we call spillable, because what you're about to see, everybody, is I'm going to use one function. It's going to return many results. Let's see what that looks like. So over here, let's start with unique, easiest one on the list, okay? So on this data set right here, I have this column over here of all the different project sites. It includes Cascadia and Gray Coast and San Clemente, etc. And I think to myself, I'd love to have a unique list of all those entries. Could I do that? Well, I've been talking to you about it. You know that you can do it. But here's what you do. You go over to a cell, you go to formulas. These functions are under the lookup and reference functions. So you'll see in here, everybody, let's just take a look at the things I was just talking about. HSTACK is here. You'll see that TOCOL and TOROW are here. You'll see that unique is here. You see that filter is here. You see that sort is here. So lookup and reference is pretty much the place where VSTACK, HSTACK, TOCOL, TOROW, WRAPCalls, WRAPROWS, XLOOKUP, unique, most of them live in this space. All right, so I need a unique list of all the project sites. On the lookup and reference drop-down menu, I grab this unique function, and it really is this easy. Hey, where are all the cells that have project sites in them? It's these cells right here. Now, there are a lot of repeats in here, right? But the unique function says, hey, show me the unique values, and there it is. And do you see that blue box I was mentioning, everybody? So I added the unique function to cell N4, and then it went, okay, well, there are this many unique values, so it spilled the unique values into this blue box. If I were to come over here and replace one of these with a different value, let's say I put in Orlando here, you'd see that Orlando went into the blue box and the blue box would get bigger. Okay, so this is what these dynamic array functions do. They take a set of data and they say, okay, you want this type of information from it? Can do. Is everybody feeling in control? Ideas, questions, frustrations, curiosities? Life is good, living's easy. Lovely. Thanks for the thumbs. Looking good. Okay. Next idea. In the same way that I just introduced you to this spillable range, right? Microsoft had to introduce a new way to reference cells if we don't know how many are going to be used. Think about this for a second with me, everybody. I have no idea how many project sites there are going to be. I just said, hey, give me the unique list. So right now there are 10, later there might be 8, later there might be 16. There's just no way for me to know. So how am I going to tell Excel which cells I want to point at if I don't know how many there are going to be? So there's this new technique that you should learn, and it goes like this. You point it first at the top cell. So in this case, that would be N4 here. And then after you do that, you put in a pound sign or hashtag or whatever the cool kids are calling it these days. It's actually called an octothorpe, in case you weren't, you want to be the nerdiest person at your next dinner party. It's called an octothorpe. Okay. But anyway, that's the thing that we're about to use. Now, how am I going to use this? So there's this little trick over here. I want to create a unique dropdown of all the sites. So on the data tab up here at the top of the screen, there is this data validation button right here. And what this lets me do is say, hey, in this cell right here, let's be very specific about what's allowed. So I click on data validation. I don't want to allow any value. What I want to do is I want to allow a list. So I pick list from the little dropdown right there. And this is where we're going to use that technique I just showed you a second ago. I say it's equal sign N4 pound sign, hashtag octothorpe, what have you. And what that does is it says, okay, we need a drop-down list, but I don't know how many things are going to be in the drop-down list. I know it starts in cell N4, and then however many things are filled in by that function, that's how many things are going to be in the drop-down. And when I click OK, sure enough, on the drop-down are all the entries from that unique function. Really nice. So I'll pick Hyderabad here. Looking good. And now, everybody, let's take a look at the filter function. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and copy these entries right here. Put them over there. Okay. So right here, I would like all of the shipments to Hyderabad. Could I do that? Well, we've been talking about that filter function, and that's exactly what we're about to use. So we go to the Formulas tab, we go to Lookup and Reference, and we want that filter function we were just talking about. And we say, yeah, hey, there are all these cells that have data in them. Great. And what would you like to use as your filter? So the first part of the filter function is, what is the array? And that's all the cells that are filled in. The second part is, how are we filtering this? Now we might say, hey, let's filter if the shipping cost is greater than 1,000. Let's filter if it was sent by truck. But in this instance, we know that we want it if the project site column is equal to Hyderabad. So for the include, I highlight that project site column, the F column, and then I put in a little equal sign, and I click on Hyderabad right there. And I hit OK. Et voila, as the French say, got yourself a little filtered data set. And you can use the little drop down and pick Cascadia. You can use the little drop down and pick San Clemente. You can use the little drop down and pick Snake River. Really very nice. So those dynamic array functions let me pull out unique entries, pull out filtered entries, pull out sorted entries to do basically anything I want with. I want you to think about the flexibility this gives you, everybody. One of the things people run into is they'll end up with like 17 different copies of the same data in a bunch of different pages and workbooks and stuff. With this type of function, you say, no, the data's over there, right? And here, I'm going to use the filtered version of it. I'm going to use a unique version of it. I'm going to use it when it's sorted and filtered and whatever I want to do with it. So you can do lots and lots of interesting things with this. All right. Excuse me. Let's keep going. All right, VSTACK. This one's super easy, everybody. Everybody take a look at my screen real quickly. You can see here on this page, I am intending to create a big list with all the employee IDs, first names, last names, and what event they attended. But I have put that data onto this tab and this tab and this tab, and they could be sprinkled out wherever. The only important thing here, everybody, is that each one of these data sets is basically structured the same with the same 4 columns. If I've got that, I actually don't have to copy and paste these together. I could just come right here to cell C6, and that VSTACK function that I've been referencing, it says, okay, what's the first array that you're stacking? I'll go over here. I'll grab these cells right here. Great. What's the second array that you're stacking? Oh, it's these cells over here. All right, great. What's the third array of cells that you're stacking? Oh, that's these cells right here. Boom, boom. So you can see there, everybody, you could just keep going basically for a very, very long time. But I've just taken those 3 different little data sets and said, hey, just stack them on top of each other. And I hit OK. Et voila, we're done. Big data set made out of 3 little data sets. Not bad. So if you remember, everybody, I told you there's an easy one-to-one relationship. You used to do VLOOKUP, now you do XLOOKUP. Super easy to understand. Then you get into some situations where you're like, it would have been nice if I could have 5 data sets kind of spread all over my workbook, and I could just take all 5 of them and go, and now they're all part of the same data set. And Microsoft went, that's a great idea. Let's give that to them. So that's where we get VSTACK from. Ideas or questions? Does that feel good to everybody? Everybody hanging on for dear life? Does everybody have that spreadsheet downloaded? You're able to follow along. There's a completed version that has all the functions already in it, and there's the PDF that has screenshots and explanations and stuff like that. So definitely make use of those there. Good. All right. Next up, TOCOL, TOROW. So col is short for column. Row is long for row. Okay. Really, this is just, it's just one of those situations you might find yourself in, right? I have 4 separate columns full of people. And I look at this and I go, I really just want one big column full of people. And this could be 20 columns. It could be 100 columns, whatever you got. So you'd look at this and go, I guess I've got some copying and pasting in my future, right? Or you just go right here and use the TOCOL function. So that's lookup and reference, TOCOL right there. And I highlight all those things that need to go into one column. Now, if you notice, everybody, there are two excuse me, considerations here. The first one is, do you want to ignore anything? So if you type in a 1 here, it will ignore blanks. And that's important because, as you can see here, there are some blanks in my little data table. So I need to type in a 1 right here. And then we have scan by column. This is just basically, do you want to scan it this way or this way as, a default option? We'll leave it set the way it is. We'll hit OK, and there it is. One big column with all your data in it. Okay. Let's round this out. And everybody, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to start to nest these functions inside of each other. Okay, so here's the scenario I'm going to paint for you. We have this table. It's full of events that people went to listed by the city. And you know that you need a row where there are entries for each of the different cities. So you want a unique list of all the cities, and you would like that unique list of the cities to be presented in a single row of data. So unique list definitely says to me the unique function. And if you want a row of things, then 2-row makes a lot of sense. Let's try this out. So I'm going to go to cell K5 here. And for this one, everybody, I'm going to write it out longhand because I just like the experience a little bit more of watching it help me. Okay, so I want to use 2-row. Now, what is the array of cells that I want to turn into a row? Well, it is all the cities, definitely. But it's not just like all the cities, because it might say Dallas 47 times in there. So instead, what we're looking for here is a unique list of all the cities. So now I use the unique function and I highlight all those cities, just like so. Then I close parentheses, close, and hit enter. And there it is. New York, Las Vegas, Dallas, Atlanta, Seattle, Miami. And if I went in here and replaced this Dallas with an Orlando, all of a sudden there would be an Orlando right there because of that spillable range, because that blue box that gets introduced. What if I wanted to go one step further? What if I wanted to sort these in alphabetical order? No problem at all. I come in here, I say, hey, let's take that unique function and let's sort them, excuse me, like so. And now it goes Atlanta, Dallas, Las Vegas, Miami, New York, Orlando, Seattle. So these functions can be used in lots of different combinations to get some very interesting things to happen. All right. 2 more areas here. But I will say that from my perspective, I think that, excuse me, unique, filter, and VSTACK are the ones of these that I'll probably use most often. Some of you may be in a lot of situations that call for like a TOCOL option, which is nice. And if you get a weird data set, this new thing called WRAPROWS might be really, really helpful. Let me show you what this does. Okay. So everybody, this is the thing I want you to look at right here. This is the ugliness. All right. We've got this thing where for some reason, some system that we connect to took all of the entries and it printed all the entries vertically down a column. It was like, yeah, the first thing is employee ID and then first name and then last name. And then it gets to the first person and here's their employee ID and here's their first name and here's the last name. And then there's another employee ID and then there's their first name and their last name. And this is just awful. Nobody should ever have to do this. This is a terrible, terrible situation. In the old days, I would have told you to do like a copy paste with a transpose. But this is this is just a lights out solution to this problem, everybody. I go to this cell right here. I go to lookup and reference, and I go that WRAPROWS. Now, the reason I'm using WRAPROWS is the following. Each one of these people is a record, right? So when I get to the end of the line, I want to go down to the next row and make a record. So for me, that means I end up using WRAPROWS a lot more than I end up using WRAPCALLS. But there are different combinations that could be relevant for you. So again, I'll go WRAPROWS here. So the vector, all right, so the vector is just their way of saying, is this a vertical data set or is it a horizontal data set? Did they give you one gigantic row of data? Did they give you one gigantic column of data? What did they do to you? Please, tell us what they did to you and how it pains you. All right, so that's my column. It's my vector right there. And then this is the part that you just got to count for. Employee ID is 1, first name is 2, last name is 3, date of hire is 4, salary is 5. 5, and then it goes to the next record. So right there, the count where we wrap is a 5. And everybody watch this magic. You just hit OK, and boom. It's just like, are you serious? I mean, that is, when you are in that kind of situation, the fact that you have a tool that does that is just outstanding. Now, many of us will never find ourselves in a terrible situation like that one. And by all means, if you never find yourself in a terrible situation, give yourself a good job, go on with your life, living a happy, calm, peaceful life. And the rest of us who have to deal with just monstrous, weird situations in Excel will make use of some of these weird things in the future. All right, looking good, everybody. So again, WRAPROWS. Again, it's a specific scenario. And here's one more specific scenario, and then we'll go ahead and pause for a second, okay? Take and drop. All right, now I don't like the terms that they used here. I don't think they make sense immediately, but here's the basic premise. With take, what I want you to imagine is you are given a big data set and you're told you're allowed to take 10 of them, or you're allowed to drop 10 of them, or 5 of them, or 20 of them, or whatever it is, right? So take means that you will grab the first 5 or 10 or 20, and the rest will be dropped. Or drop means you'll drop 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 and take the rest of them. So they're opposites of each other. So why would you need something like that? Well, in this instance, I made up a scenario where I wanted to know what the top 10 accounts by value are. And then later, maybe I want to know the bottom 10. So this is kind of a weird situation, right? A lot of people would look at this and go, well, Neil, I don't really see the need for it because I could just go to that data set, sort it by value, and look at the top 10 data sets. And then later I could resort it so I could look at the bottom 10 data sets. But then you get into this problem where you're constantly taking that data set and resorting and recopying and doing all sorts of different things. So if you can leave the data where it is and dynamically pull out what's relevant to you, it can be really very useful in certain situations. So this is what we need to do. We need to take the top 10 value accounts. How are we going to do that? Take doesn't have like a max function built into it or anything like that. So what we have to do is we have to use the sort function to tell it what order those values need to be in. So again, I'll write this out longhand because I like this. I just like the way that it auto completes for me. I'm going to use =, take to take the top 10 rows. But how am I going to get the top 10? What does that mean? Well, here I can sort all of those entries right there, okay? So take from C6 to F1054, comma, sort them by the third column, sort index, and then comma, and then you see here we have either ascending or descending order. And this is why I like to pull it up this way, everybody. It's because that other box doesn't often give us the 1 and -1 as options here, but now with this little drop down, it does. So I know that I want to sort this in descending order to put the biggest values on top. So I put a little -1 in there. And then how many rows do I want? I want 10 rows. So take the top 10 rows. If we take all of that stuff and sort it, let's see here. Good, there we go. And there you are, the top 10 account values out of this data set. It just magically found those for us. And we could imagine ourselves pulling out things that are relevant, sort by the things that are most out of date, sort by the things that have the highest expense, sort by the things that are bought most often, and then take those elements out so we can use them and analyze them. So take and drop are interesting functions in very specific scenarios. All right. Everybody, I'm going to, at this moment in time, just take a beat. Free webinar, shock of all shocks. I'm here to give you a quick ad. Quick ad goes like this. I run a training company. We do live hands-on training with all sorts of clients on all sorts of Microsoft software. If you are interested in another free session on the Knack Training Notion site that is in the chat right now, you'll see a link to register for next Wednesday's session about data mining. Later on this week, you'll receive an email about public classes that you can register for that are paid. And if you have anybody at your company who needs training, definitely reach out via the email address that just went into the chat right there, info@knacktraining.com. I think we can help a lot of people. End of speech. Yes, Joseph's asking the question, do we do training on macros? We do training on macros, we do training on Office scripts, we do training on Power Automate, and a wide range of other automation tools. So absolutely, seek us out. I'm happy to help out. All right, end of spiel, everybody. Thanks so much for sticking with me for the 27 seconds of the advertisement here. All right, next up on the hit parade, everybody, if you are the sort of person who has had to take text and break it up, right? If you've had to break up people's names, addresses, all sorts of different things, and you've tried out text to columns and you've tried out left, right, and mid and all sorts of different things, these new text functions, TEXTSPLIT, TEXTBEFORE, and TEXTAFTER are very interesting stuff. I see there's a question from Ezel about do you prefer macros or functions? The way that I am tilting right now, everybody, I'll just, sort of the reason I said we teach about macros, we teach about Office scripts, we teach about Power Automate, is because the way that everything has been shifting over the last decade clearly shows that Microsoft is not as invested in the lifespan of VBA within the Office products, and it's much more invested in automating across products or automating using the cloud services. So when it comes to macros, I still use a limited number of macros on my desktop machine to help me set up files. But then beyond that, I use a wide range of other automation tools because very often my spreadsheets are plugged into other things. And so we sort of go off book from VBA into other spaces. So yeah, my love affair with macros is definitely dwindling at this point. Microsoft is definitely not investing a ton in making VBA better every year, but it's definitely still a very, very powerful space to work in. All right, so everybody, let me show you TEXTSPLIT, TEXTBEFORE, and TEXTAFTER. Some very interesting tools. So Item number one, everybody, in case you were curious as to whether it's worth it. All right, let me zoom in. I'll zoom in. Okay, in the old days, if I wanted to get Armando's name off of Armando Kennedy, I would have made something that looks like that. That's ugly. Look at that. Oh, it's a face only a mother could love. Mid, find, and len all in the same thing. What's actually happening here is we're using the find function to figure out where the comma is. However, we don't want to get the information starting from the comma. We want to go not one, but two positions past the comma, because one position past the comma is where the space is, and two positions past the comma is where the A in Armando is. So that's that part. Now we take that, we give it back to the mid function. We say, hey, mid function, go to the spot where the A starts. And then it asks the question, how much do you want to get back? And I say, I don't know. I don't know how long Armando is. Let's just use the length of the whole thing and get the rest of it. This is not fun to type. It's not fun to teach. This right here, oh, this is so much fun. Equal sign text before. You know what it does? Or excuse me, text after, excuse me. Text after. You know what text after does? It finds all the text after something. What? That sounds so complicated, Neil. No, exactly. It's the easiest thing in the world. Text after. Click on that text. After what? Well, in the text, there's a comma and a space, just like that. Find me the comma and the space, and they get me all the text after the comma and the space. And I hit enter, and it gets me Armando, exactly the same way that this ugly thing did. And then over here, of course, we have equal sign text before, which does the exact opposite. You click on that text, and you say, hey, yeah, find me where the comma is, and get me all the text that comes before the comma. I hit enter. So much easier to do that. Just not, it's like night and day. So much easier. Now, everybody, as I was preparing for this, I thought I knew what the text split function really did. And then I dug in a little bit harder, and I found something so beautiful. And so I decided I wanted to show it to y'all. So in my classes, I very often reference how Power Query is the most powerful part of all of Excel. You should 100% learn it, and it does so many things to clean up data. And this is one of the examples I used. So I want you to imagine a scenario here, everybody, where it's your job to create a unique list of all the people who showed up. Now, how exactly would you do that? You gotta break this up, right? You gotta break up Marcos Fuentes and Chibui and Sarah Kamari and Ariel Gonzalez. You gotta break those. But you also don't just want to use text to columns, because text to columns will make a bunch of columns and a bunch of rows of data. Well, TextSplit does something really beautiful. You ready for this? So equal sign TextSplit. And I click onto that data right there. And then it asks me, what is my column delimiter? Now, it's important to think about that. Do I want to make another column next to this column with somebody else's name? I don't think so. Do I, though, want to make a new row? I do. So I leave the column delimiter empty. And then what I do is I put the semicolon in for the row delimiter, and I hit enter, and it gives me, boom, 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 these 4 people spilled down, right? But watch this, everybody. You don't have to do this one row at a time. Instead of I6 right here, you go in and you highlight all these, just like so. I6 through I1100, split it every time you find a semicolon. And I hit enter, and that's everybody. You see that? That is every single person in that list. The amount of time it would have taken me to do that in the old days in Excel is absurd. And then all you have to do here is you add a little unique function to it, like we've been doing. And now you know that it's a unique list of all those people. Boom, just like that. So helpful. So very, very interesting in lots of situations. All right, so everybody, we got about 10 minutes left, and I want to show you things that could significantly help your workbooks. However, let me push full pause right here. I think of XLOOKUP, unique filter, and TEXTSPLIT and TEXTBEFORE as the most clear and obvious solutions to problems that will definitely help you today, tomorrow, next week. Let and LAMBDA are definitely more higher order functions for you to think about how you build your workbooks. So if you put a pin in this for yourself, everybody, push that mental save button. We've done a really good job on some very, very practical functions. Now I'm going to talk to you about some functions that could be very useful, but are going to take a lot more energy on your part. So what are let and LAMBDA? They allow us to make our own custom versions of functions that work better for us. Let's talk about let first. So I have a coworker who used to teach algebra in elementary school, or that sort of thing. And I was talking to her about this, and she was like, yeah, I mean, variables, that's something that comes up all the time, right? So everybody, right here in cell G6, I just wanted you to take a second and look at this ugliness for me right there, okay? So the scenario I'm painting for you is the following. When you look at the sales in this table, you need to take the price per unit and multiply it by the number of units, definitely. So that is E6 times F6. Now, the second part, though, is that we've decided that if E6 times F6 is greater than 500,000, then we should multiply it by 90%. If it's not more than 500,000, we should just output E6 times F6. If it's more than 500,000, actually test whether it's more than 1 million. If it's not more than 1 million, multiply it by 90%. And if it is more than 1 million, multiply it by 80%. Do you see how many times I have said E6 times F6 in this cell? If you ever find yourself in this situation where you keep on doing the same calculation over and over and over and over again, I want you to think about how many times you could make mistakes in there, right? I'm taking E6 times F6. Could I make a mistake and multiply it by something I shouldn't multiply it by? 100% I could. Also, if I write it, let's take a look at how many times it's in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is in here 5 separate times, which means that Excel is calculating it 5 separate times. And that means that if you have something that's really complicated, it's going to be really troubling. It's going to slow everything down. So watch what you could do with let here, everybody. With let, what you can do is invent a variable. So I'm going to do equal sign let, there we go. And what I'm going to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Alt-Enter on my keyboard, and I'm going to say, okay, the first thing I want to do is I want to come up with a variable called, let's call it standard price. Now, standard price should be equal to E6 times F6. Now, everybody, that's the last time I need to multiply E6 times F6, because after this, I then can go in and I can say if the standard price is greater than 500,000, then, actually, let's do less than, sorry. Let's do less than 500,000, then we do the standard price. If it's not less than 500,000, then test if the standard price is less than 1 million. If it's not, take the standard price, excuse me, if it's not more than 500,000, if it's less than 1 million, then take the standard price and multiply it by 0.9. Otherwise, take the standard price and multiply it by 0.8. So everybody, that is the thing I want you to see. Let doesn't really introduce a new function to your world. What it lets you do is say, hey, the way that I had written that before is really just too gnarly for me. So I'm going to go ahead of time and I'm going to make up a variable and I'm going to stash that as a variable and use it in my function to make that function a lot cleaner to read farther down the line. So it's definitely something that's interesting for people with big, complicated functions. All right. And lastly, everybody, because we're in the home stretch here, let's talk about LAMBDA. Now, again, LAMBDA is something that solves a problem you might not know that you have. So let's talk this through. If you are ever in a situation where in your workbook, there is a calculation that's kind of difficult to understand, it's got some logic in it that only you really understand today, and sometimes it's difficult to write and all of that stuff, then what you can do is you can use the LAMBDA function to save that as a simplified version of itself. So here's the scenario I want to show you, everybody. It is possible that I want to use the dateDiff function using this date and today's date and output the number of years between those two dates. Now, this is something not everybody knows how to do. It doesn't give you a lot of assistance in making this, and ultimately it's really easy to make mistakes here. So rather than writing this function every time, and rather than having my people try to figure out what's going on with that function, what you do instead is you write this thing right here. You write a LAMBDA function. And inside the LAMBDA function, you put in any arguments you want people to use in your calculation. In this case, I said, give me the start date. And then what I'll do is I'll take the start date and I'll put it into that dateDiff function for you and finish the rest of it. Now, what you do now is you take this thing that you made and you come up here to the name manager and you invent a new function, see here with the new button, that we call, for example, total years. And what we do is we set that equal to the LAMBDA function. So the LAMBDA function takes in any arguments and then tells you what the function actually is. But what you do is you rename it to something like total years. And when you click OK, now you can come in here and say =, total years, and give it the start date. Now, everybody, do you see how the second part of that interaction is incredibly easy? Because what we did is we took the complicated part and we hid it inside the LAMBDA function. So those are two examples of things that might solve problems that you're not even sure that you necessarily had walking in the door, as opposed to plenty of these other functions that clearly have a very set in stone use case. All right, everybody, I appreciate your time and energy today. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Please let me know by email if there is anything that I can do for you, anything that I can answer. If you lose track of any of the course files, the guides, and things like that, definitely send me an email. And if you want specific training about anything in particular, again, reach out directly, and I'm happy to help out. Thanks, Leanna. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Florina. Thanks, Angela. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.